Hello, this is cjhoyle. In this video, I'm going to be replacing the speed control trigger switch on this hand drill here with this replacement one that I purchased for it. So about 5 years ago, I purchased this drill, which is branded Mastercraft, which is the store brand of a store called Canadian Tire. I bought this drill in a kit, which also included an impact driver, as well as 2 batteries and a battery charger. This is a consumer grade product, which would not be sufficient for a contractor who uses it every day, but for the amount of drilling that I do as a hobbyist, it's been more than adequate. After more than 5 years of use, I've been quite impressed by how well the lithium-ion batteries have been holding up. They still seem to hold the charge for a really long time, and the tools still seem to be working pretty well, with the exception of a few issues that I've been noticing with the drill. Up until a couple of months ago, the triggers on both of these devices worked in the same way, in that when you held the button down and then you released it, as soon as you took your finger off, the motor would stop spinning. The impact driver is still doing that, but if I do the same on the drill now, it just slows down gradually. Now for my purposes, that isn't really an issue, but I have been noticing another thing which is an issue, and that is that when I'm drilling through something and I have to hold my finger down on the trigger for a while, for example, if I'm drilling through something that's pretty hard or pretty thick, I notice that there's a funny smell that comes from the drill, and it kind of smells like burning. At first I thought this might be an indication that the brushes of the motor might need to be replaced, so I took the drill apart to investigate, and I actually found out that the brushes on this inexpensive drill actually are not replaceable, but I also could see that they had lots of life left on them, so that wasn't the problem. While I had the whole thing apart, I also tried squeezing on the trigger and holding it down for a while, and I actually noticed some smoke coming out from where the switch is, or the speed control is, which told me that that's probably what the problem is, so I ordered another one to install in its place. So the first step for disassembly is to take the battery off, and you can see there's quite a few screws here on the back to be removed, but before you do that, you first want to take the chuck off of the drill. So to do that, you want to start by expanding the drill chuck to its biggest possible size. On the inside you should see a screw head. In my case it's a Phillips screw head, but sometimes these have other types of heads, such as Torx heads. Find an appropriately sized screwdriver and put it in there and remove that screw. It's important to know that this is a left-handed thread, which means you need to rotate in the opposite direction to what you're accustomed to for loosening off most screws. Removing this screw this time was actually quite easy, but the first time that I removed it, it was really tight in there, and I ended up using my impact driver to help me remove it that time. Next, you want to find your largest size Allen key and put that inside the chuck of the drill and tighten it on. Now to remove the chuck, you'll want to spin this off in the counterclockwise direction because the chuck is threaded on using a standard right-handed thread. Again, in my case, this was held on there pretty loosely, but if it was on there tighter, I could have used my impact driver again and tighten the chuck onto the end of there and use this to remove it instead. Now the final step before I can remove these screws to get inside is to take off this clutch mechanism from the front here, and you can see that's held in place using this retaining ring that goes around there, and that's done by putting a tool in there and spreading those 2 holes apart so that the ring can get around this wider section here. So after you got that clip removed, you want to be really careful when taking this part out because there's a spring behind there, and there's also a little ball bearing, and you want to make sure that you take it off slowly so you can capture that ball bearing. Alright, now the moment we've all been waiting for. I can actually take these screws out. Alright, so 9 screws removed. I can now take this top cover off. So with the case apart, this is what that switch looks like. So it actually does a number of things. It controls the speed that the motor moves at, and there's also this little switch up here, which is what you press from side to side to change from going forwards to backwards or keeping it in the middle position for the drill to be turned off. On my drill, it's really obvious that the problem with it is the switch, because when I sniff it, I can really smell that electrical burning smell that I described earlier. So here's the new switch that I purchased for it, and as you can see, they look very similar. And hopefully this will fit in there exactly as I need it to. The switch also comes with some wires that are soldered onto it. And so the wires on the top here are going to be routed around here and get soldered directly to the motor. Then at the bottom, there's two wires that come down and go to the battery. These wires are shorter than they need to be, so I'm probably just going to solder the existing ones directly onto it. And there's also a wire at the bottom which goes to this little LED, which goes down here. But essentially, my next job is to get my soldering iron out and unsolder all the wires which lead to this switch. In order to get better access to the solder points, I'm removing everything from the case. Everything lifts out pretty easily from here. Using my soldering iron, I heated up each solder joint and pulled the wires off. I found this task a lot more challenging than what I was expecting, mostly because they used a higher temperature solder than what I'm accustomed to working with. The most powerful soldering iron that I have is only 35 watts, and although it served me well for many electronics repairs, it's just barely hot enough to melt the solder that was used here. Alright, so I've now got all the leads which are leading to the switch unsoldered. Now I've got to resolder those to the points on the new switch, which means first removing the solder joints for the new wires that I'm not going to end up using. The solder that came with this new switch seems to be lower temperature, so these wires are coming off quite a bit easier. So I've now got all the wires removed from the parts that lead to the new switch here, with the exception of the ones that lead to the little LED, and I figure I'll just leave this LED on, as opposed to using the old one. I might as well replace that part too. So now I'm connecting the old wires to the appropriate points in the new switch. I did this by inserting each wire through the available hole, then applied flux and new solder to the joint. Alright, so I've now got all the leads soldered on there. And before I go any further with this, I'm going to do a little bit of a test to make sure that this new switch works correctly with there. So I'm going to put the battery on, like that, and I'm going to hold onto the motor. And it's working, and if I flick the switch here for the direction, it works in the other direction too. So I put most of the components back inside the case now, and one thing that I was noticing is that this new switch is actually a little bit different than the old one. From this angle they look, very similar, pretty much the same, but if you rotate them, you can see that the new switch is a little bit narrower than the old one. I don't think that'll be a problem, because if it's narrower then it should be able to fit, but if it was the other way around, that might cause some kind of a problem. The other thing that I've noticed is that it takes a little bit more effort to squeeze this one. It's a little bit tighter than this one was. But again, I think it's still going to work for me. So let's put things back together the rest of the way. This is the button for changing directions, and that button needs to go in here like that, and this hole here at the top of the switch needs to go inside of that button there. And then that goes in there like that. It's really important to also make sure that all the wires running to the different parts of it are pushed down inside their correct places so that they're not going to get caught inside the edges when you close the case. But now I should be able to put this other half back on. And now I can put all 9 screws back in place. So after putting in a few screws, I decided to do a small test by reinserting the battery. And I found a little bit of a problem. So of course the trigger, it works the way that it's supposed to, but when I release the trigger, the drill is still turning. And I believe the reason has to do with the shape of the switch down here. So like I mentioned earlier, this piece of plastic here on the switch is a little bit different on the new switch than it was on the old one. And you can see, for example, at the sides there's a little bit of a gap. But also at the very front edge there, this is a different shape there as well. And you can see there's a little bit of a gap there, which prevents this switch from springing all the way back. And that's why it's always running. It never completely shuts off. If you compare that to the piece that came out of this, it's got a round edge, where this one sort of got a flat edge with rounded corners. So I took it apart again, and I started by using a small file to round over the edges here so that it would be more similar to how the existing one was, but I was finding that it still wasn't popping back out all the way, and it was not allowing it to use the braking mechanism to stop. So I ended up just filing off that lip in the blue plastic here, and now this is able to have full travel. So as you can see, when I release it, not only does it stop turning, but the brake actually applies. and it stops immediately, the way that it did when I first got it. So now to continue putting things back together, there's a spring that goes in here, and after that there's a small ball bearing which goes over top of that, and that's just going to sit there like that. And then this black ring goes on there, and I'm going to put it so that it's in the least tight clutch position, being very careful not to lose that spring, like that. And then my ring needs to go back on there. Alright, so I got that retaining ring back on, and I'm able to use the clutch the way that it's supposed to work. And now the chuck goes back on, remembering that it's a conventional right-handed thread. And I'll just make it a little bit tighter using the Allen key. And now I'll open the jaws up all the way and take this left-handed thread locking screw and put it in there using the appropriate screwdriver. And now this drill is back together again, ready to keep on using until these batteries finally stop working. So now I answer the question, was it worth all that work to repair this cheap old drill? For me, the answer is yes. The smoke that I saw pouring out of the drill was an obvious sign that I couldn't keep using it the way that it was. I looked into buying a replacement, and the price for an equivalent Mastercraft drill is $170, although when they go on sale, they're only $100. Neither of those prices include tax. On the other hand, the price I paid for this switch was only $13 Canadian, including shipping. Now I have no idea how much longer these 5-year-old lithium-ion batteries are going to keep on working, but when they do eventually stop holding a charge, I'll probably end up replacing both the drill and impact driver. But in the meantime, it's nice to be able to continue using the tools that I already have. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.